The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. America is a democracy, which in the immortal words of Abraham Lincoln means government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is a noble sentiment. The movement for democracy has motivated millions of people across the globe to action. Woodrow Wilson labeled World War I as a war to make the world safe for democracy. Democracy is not perfect, which has surprised no one since it's a human institution. But what's the proper response to the limits of democracy? And how is this relevant at all to the research of economists who do in the area of public choice or political economy? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about a new book which has raised some of these timeless questions for public choice is Dr. Art Carden, an associate professor of economics at Samford University. Art was an undergraduate at the University of Alabama and earned his PhD in economics from Washington University. He's taught at Rhodes College before coming to Samford. Art has published dozens of academic articles in the areas of public choice and market economics. He's a fellow with the Independent Institute, the Beacon Center, the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and he's an adjunct faculty member with the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Art's also a longtime friend of the Johnson Center, and he contributed a chapter to our 2015 volume, Improving Lives in Alabama. Welcome to EconVersations, Art.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here.
And thanks again for agreeing to come on the show today. We're always happy to have you here at Troy.
Oh, it's fantastic to be here at Troy.
And we'll just start off with, this is not our topic for today, but you did graciously contribute a chapter to our Alabama policy book, which you can see on the Johnson Center's website if you want to take a look at that. And so let's get into this topic here today. There's a new book out, at least in our circles, that's raising a lot of interest, although I don't think people should look for it on the New York Times bestsellers list. It's something that's very exciting in academic circles or newsworthy in academic circles is not necessarily going to be out there on the bestsellers list. But it raises some interesting points about one of our fields of study of public choice, and one of the leading scholars in this field, James Buchanan.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about this new book and some of the controversy.
Yeah, so these are very interesting times to study public choice because there are, in fact, actually several books that are related to Buchanan and his research agenda that have come out. The one that you're referring to is by Nancy McLean. It's called Democracy in Chains, and you might actually want to look for it on the New York Times bestseller list. It's published by It's published by Viking. It's selling very well on Amazon. It was listed by Oprah Winfrey's magazine as one of the 20 must-read books of the summer. So it's getting a lot of play. Unfortunately, I don't think the book presents an accurate explanation of Buchanan, an accurate explanation of public choice economics, or an accurate explanation of Buchanan's forebears or his legacy. Now, to that end, there are a couple of other books that are again, these are the ones you probably won't find on the bestseller list. One by Buchanan's longtime collaborator Richard Wagner, titled James M. Buchanan and Liberal Political Economy, and Wagner's book is an attempt to situate Buchanan's ideas within modern intellectual debates, modern policy debates. It's not really an intellectual biography of Buchanan so much as it is an assessment of his major ideas and kind of where they stand today. And then another that's related is by another one of Buchanan's former colleagues, David Levy, and then Sandra Peart at George Mason University and the University of Richmond. It's called Escape from Democracy. And it's actually about, in many ways, it's about the role of experts in the making of public policy. And it offers a really interesting discussion based on some of their earlier research on Buchanan's experience at the University of Virginia, and specifically how there was sort of a secret covert report on the activities of Buchanan and his colleagues at the Thomas Jefferson Center at the university, and ultimately they ended up breaking up the Jefferson Center, and the scholars associated with it moved on. Now that group included 2 eventual Nobel laureates. Buchanan was one of them, the other was Ronald Coase, and then also Gordon Tullock, who was a perennial contender for the Nobel Prize until he passed away just a couple of years ago. So this is a very interesting time to study public choice, and there's probably going to be more popular attention directed at Buchanan and his research agenda than probably at any other time up to this point.
Now, some of what's contained in the new book by historian Nancy McLean is somewhat controversial, but in one sense, the title of this book is not completely off target, because it does emphasize an element of Buchanan's work, and that's what we really want to get into today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. When most people think of democracy, they just think of good government or good governance, rather than as a set of political, or rather than as a set of decision-making institutions that aggregate preferences up into these social choices. Or Buchanan often described himself as a Democrat, or a small d Democrat, meaning in a sense he was analytically very egalitarian. He didn't believe in elites and non-elites, rather he believed in some sense that all men were created equal, which that sounds, it's an interesting sentiment. I kind of have to wonder where he would have gotten such an idea. But the idea of putting democracy in chains is in fact actually something that, for a lot of different reasons, we shouldn't necessarily be skeptical of. In fact, one of the elements of a really good, well-functioning political system is that it has checks and balances that prevent majorities from exploiting minorities, but that also prevent minorities from exploiting majorities.
So, in one sense, the claim that Buchanan scholarship is anti-democratic or undemocratic is hardly any new. I think 30 years ago, Stephen Kellman came out with a paper in, I think it was in National Affairs, with this title. And in fact, James Buchanan, writing at the time, was willing to engage this whole issue of is there something wrong with public choice scholarship, right? Yeah, and that raises a really interesting question, because the contribution that public choice makes is something that shouldn't really be that controversial. It basically says, if we assume people are going to be self-interested when they're in the marketplace, we might also want to assume that they're self-interested when they're in the voting booth. If we're going to assume that people have limited information and limited knowledge when they're in the marketplace, they're probably also going to have limited information and limited knowledge when they're in the voting booth. In short, we take the set of assumptions we make about people in one context and we apply them to another. So it's very much a realist approach to how political decisions are made. He referred to it as politics without romance, where the version that we might have learned in elementary school or middle school or high school, or from watching Schoolhouse Rock videos, would be sort of like this very, very high aspirational notion of what politics can be if we all come together. And there might be something to be said for that. But Buchanan's argument, and where I think he got a lot of explanatory power, was in applying a lot of the assumptions that we make in analyzing market behavior to the analysis of political behavior. And so we've now started to get into a little bit into public choice here. I think another thing that's going to be important for us is to understand a distinction that we often bring up in our economics classes between what's referred to as positive economics and normative economics. So if you could explain to us what these terms are, and then we'll talk about like whether public choice is positive or normative.
Yeah, so positive statements are statements about how the world is. Normative statements are statements about how the world should be. So an example of a positive statement in economics would be that increasing the minimum wage will reduce employment opportunities for the least of these among us. So those who are at the margin of the labor market, quite literally, if you raise the minimum wage, as Birmingham actually tried to do, to $10.10 an hour, someone whose labor is only valuable at, or whose labor is only worth hiring at $9 an hour is not going to be able to get a job. That's a positive statement, that having this policy, a higher minimum wage, will reduce employment opportunities for for people, that's a positive statement. It can be tested against data. It's simply it's a statement about how the world is. It's a statement that could very easily be wrong, obviously, and there's a lot of debate about the magnitude of the effect or the direction of the effect when it comes to something like the minimum wage. But there's no ethical content or no ethical assumptions per se when we're making positive statements. Now, when we make normative statements, we're making statements about how the world should be. So economics per se is not a normative discipline. A lot of us obviously we bring certain ethical commitments to it. We don't like poverty, we don't like unemployment, we want to see everybody get rich and things like that. So we might say the government should get rid of tariffs because that will increase prosperity and lower prices and what have you. That's a normative statement. A positive statement is if we reduce tariffs, so if we get rid of, say, the American sugar program, if we get rid of restrictions on international trade in sugar, that will lower the price of sugar, and presumably Americans will probably start to sweeten Coca-Cola and Pepsi and things like that with sugar rather than corn syrup. That would be a positive statement. Reducing tariffs leads to cheaper sugar.
So the analysis of democracy that James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock pioneered, would that fit into the positive or normative category?
So their analysis was definitely positive. So as economists, Buchanan, Tullock, kind of all of those people who are operating within this general framework are very much engaged in a positive analysis. So they're saying, here's how things are. Or if we make this set of assumptions, then the models we're developing will have the following predictions. And then those predictions perhaps they're borne out by the data or they're falsified by the data. These again are positive claims. They're not normative claims about how people should behave. Now Buchanan, as a political philosopher, obviously had a lot of he had a lot of ideas about how he thought the world should be. But as an economist, he's doing what economists do best, which is taking a handful of very simple assumptions and then getting an enormous amount of explanatory power out of them.
So, as we'll get into in the next few minutes here, some of the specific public choice analyses of democracy, but public choice does come up with identify some of the problems or difficulties of democracy. Now, again, understanding from a positive standpoint, we're not saying that we're not in effect celebrating or gloating that we have these problems with democracy. It really is much like, say, if you're a football coach and you have to analyze, whether somebody on your team is weak or what the weaknesses of your team that another team might exploit. If you don't do that kind of self-examination, if you don't figure out what's wrong, then it's hard to inform any kind of discussion about what to do differently, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to put it, or a really good way to think about it. So when I think about democracy, there are a couple of ways you can think about democracy. Again, you can think about it almost as like a philosophical, like an egalitarian philosophical commitment, where we each have, so where everybody has a claim to a voice. Okay, that's a great way to think about it. You can also think about democracy as a set of decision-making institutions, and so I would argue that Buchanan was a Democrat in the first sense, in that he believed he was what we might call an analytical egalitarian. Everybody is equal, but a lot of his research agenda pointed out some of the problems with democracy as a set of decision-making institutions, because there are, again, depending on what the rules are, ways that majorities can do awful things to minorities. And we see this all throughout American history. Or ways that under certain rules, minorities can exploit majorities, or where special interests can get rich at everybody else's expense.
So now let's get into some of the more details here. So if you think of democracy as the rule of the people, that sounds like a great idea.
Oh, absolutely.
But we run into some problems here once we start to get a little more concrete, a little more refined in our analysis, right?
Absolutely. So one way to think about this is in the context of a family. So I have 3 kids. My older son is about to turn 9. I have a daughter who's 7, another son who's 5. So you have my wife and I, who are sort of the adults of the household, and then 3 kids. The problems of majoritarian democracy in this setting should be immediately apparent. If we made every decision by majority rule, in our house. As much as I love my kids and as wise as they are, I think for their ages, I don't know that we would be making decisions that are good for the household in the long run. You know, there are only so many times you can eat ice cream for dinner before you start to realize that you're perhaps making some bad choices. So that in itself should tell us that that majoritarian democracy as a set of decision-making institutions is going to come. It's going to come with some built-in problems.
And just another whole issue you've already gotten into in terms of majority rule, and the people governing makes great sense when you're talking about one person with one will. But once you recognize that, as this picture here of some recent clashes between Trump supporters and their opponents shows not everybody has the same views on things, right?
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. So one of the problems that we run into in trying to have civilization, you know, to say nothing of making good social decisions, just having civilization period, is how do we take lots and lots of people with different skills, different talents, different beliefs, different views, different ideas, different values, and have them all get along in some form or fashion. So when I talk about Buchanan being an analytical egalitarian or being a small d Democrat, he was not one, and the scholars working in his tradition are not those to force their views on others. Now, there are things I believe that are true that I'm sure you disagree with, and I'm sure there are things that you believe are true that I disagree with. The proper way to do that in a civilized and decent society is for us to exchange propositions and try to test our beliefs against logic and evidence. We can have that conversation, and we can have that conversation in the public square to a certain degree, but ultimately finding a way to make public decisions without forcing our views on others, without forcing our beliefs on others, that can be very, very difficult. That's a really, really hard problem to solve. And as we saw a little bit ago, even in the context of a family with 5 people, where I know my kids better than anyone else in the world does, and my kids know us fairly well. Or they know me well, they know my wife well. Even in this context where we see each other every day and we know one another's preferences pretty well, collective decision making can still be very, very difficult. When you blow that up to a city of 10,000 people or a country of 320 million, then the problem just gets completely out of hand.
And another problem you hinted at already, but let's go into a little more detail. I mean, sometimes majorities don't necessarily want to treat minorities very nicely, right? Right.
Yeah. And again, so if we think about the family example, and it's a somewhat tongue-in-cheek example, if we tried to make by majority decision strictly within the household choices about what we would eat or what we would spend our money on, well, my wife and I are outvoted by our 3 kids.
Right.
So our children could exploit us in some sense by via majority vote deciding we're going to do all of these different things. Or I have 2 sons, and then there are 2 sons and myself, and then my wife and my daughter. So we could have a different majority coalition of boys. So three males, 2 females. Well, if we have a majority coalition of males, we can decide that we're going to do all of this stuff that appeals to us and nothing that appeals to my wife, nothing that appeals to my daughter. So there could be this, so there could be, in this very real sense, a tyranny of a majority coalition. To sort of step away from things that a lot of us have experience with and that are fairly innocuous, because family decisions aren't really that problematic. If we look at the history of the American South, it's an example of what happens when you have political institutions that allow majorities, and in the case of the history of the South, white Southerners, to exploit minorities, which would be, again, in the history of the South, black Southerners. Jim Crow, I think, is a perfect example of majorities doing terrible things to members of minorities. And now, granted, it's very, very complicated, very complicated, very, very difficult. But in principle, when you don't have the right set of checks and balances, you leave minorities vulnerable to political exploitation.
Yeah.
I think a really good example of this happened with streetcar legislation in the South in the early 20th century. A lot of streetcar companies actually wanted to integrate because running 2 half-full streetcars or running 2 half-full railroad cars is more expensive than running 1 full one. But they ended up being forced politically to segregate, which I think is again, an example of a majority using using political institutions to inflict costs on a minority.
Another whole set of problems of democracy emerges out once you introduce what are known as information costs. The fact that if I want to figure out what you like or dislike or want to have happen, it actually is going to take some time for me to actually talk to you or communicate in this fashion. And one of the forms of information or consequences of the cost of information is something that's known as rational ignorance.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about this and some of the problems that emerge from that.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why economists are big hits at parties. We talk about things like rational ignorance, and there's, of course, everyone in the room wants to be around us and hear what we have to say about rational ignorance. And again, this kind of puts you back on your heels a bit because you think, well, when could it be rational to be ignorant? And it can be rational, and I put this in like very, very big quotation marks, to be ignorant when acquiring additional information is really not going to change the outcome. So we all know who the president is, or we pretty much all know who the president is, or we know who the governor of Alabama is, we know who our senators are. A surprising number of people in the United States don't know who their congressional representative is. I'll be honest, when I stepped into the voting booth in 2016, and to be fair, we had just moved to a different part of Birmingham, so I'd like to think there's at least sort of some excuse for this. I learned when I looked at my ballot that I didn't live in the congressional district I thought I lived in. So my life there was nothing wrong with my life up to that point. There's really been nothing that's changed in my life since then. My vote in that election didn't really matter. Most people, well, I don't know if it's most people, but a surprising number of people don't know who their elected representatives are. They don't know who their city council people are. And this is because acquiring that information is costly. You could learn a lot about legislation, learn a lot about, you could spend your time watching C-SPAN, or you could spend your time watching Netflix, or you could spend your time watching EconVersations. I think the choice there is obvious, right?
Yes.
It's costly to acquire a lot of this information about public policy and who the public policy makers are, and I'll be honest, C-SPAN is not really as entertaining as Netflix is.
Right.
I would rather watch Stranger Things than debates in the House of Representatives. Not knowing what's going on in the House of Representatives really doesn't change my life that much, and that's going to be true of most voters. My vote in a presidential election, in a senatorial election, in almost any election is almost certainly not going to be decisive. So I have very few incentives beyond just civic virtue, we'll say, to learn a lot about what's really fundamentally going on.
Another element, way in which information costs come in here is that, any elected representative has thousands of constituents, and there's simply no way they could actually sit down with each of them and get a sense of, like, what do you want me to do? I'm your representative. What do you want me to do? Even leaving aside the question of if they have different goals that they want them to pursue. In a framework like this, not everyone's simply going to be able to communicate, and that leads to actually somewhat surprisingly some power for special interests, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. If you think about, so Don Boudreaux, who is an economist at George Mason University, he said one time about looking at the Code of Federal Regulation, and I hope I'm getting this right, he pulled a volume off the shelf, turned to a random page, and just closed his eyes and stuck his finger in the book somewhere, and found some regulation creating, I think it was like the Southwest Texas Cabbage Growers Association or something to that effect. Living in Alabama, I know nothing about the Southwest Texas cabbage market or the Southwest Texas Cabbage Growers Association. You can bet, though, that the people who are growing cabbage in Southwest Texas know all about this association. They know all about the rules governing what they're doing. So it's very, very costly for me to obtain information, particularly given that obtaining that information will not necessarily change public policy. Whereas for the special interest, pardon me, say the Southwest Texas cabbage growers, they have a much stronger incentive to obtain information and then use that information to try to get the public policy that they want.
And so then they're the only ones who's going to raise their voice or take the time and effort to do this. So we have a number of problems here with democracy. So you could also think of it as like a doctor saying, okay, there's some things that are wrong with you.
Right.
Now the question would be, well, what are you going to do in response to it? And this is, I think, where a lot of this, the accusations that somehow Buchanan's analysis or public choice analysis could be like giving up on democracy. Right. One response you could take to this is say, well, let's try and make democracy better, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let's try to find ways to make democracy better. And there are presumably ways to do that. Deliberative democracy, I think, is an important ideal where we we sit down and we discuss, okay, what are going to be the rules of the household? What are going to be the rules of the town, the city, the village, the country? And here again, I think Buchanan, as the small d Democrat, analytical egalitarian, really shines here. And of course, he's not going to be alone. Most people, I think, are going to fall into this camp that if we're going to make collective decisions, this would be a great way to do it. But again, we run into a lot of these information problems. We run into problems associated with exploitation of minorities by majorities, or perhaps of majorities by minorities, if the rules are such that they reward special interests. Then there's also the problem of the fact that even in very, very simple settings, there is no such thing as the will of the people. One of the predecessors, by a couple of years, of Buchanan was an economist named Kenneth Arrow. And Arrow, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize, very famously showed that there's effectively no stable set of social preferences. That any social decision is going to, in some sense, depend on the rules. So one example of this is what might be called vote cycling. And one example of instability would be vote cycling. So if you imagine that you have three people. So let's just say my kids, Jacob, Taylor, Grace, and David, and we're trying to decide where we want to go out to eat. And they each rank three places, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, and Pizza Hut. We'll say you can construct examples in which McDonald's would beat Pizza Hut in a pairwise election, and Pizza Hut would beat Chick-fil-A in a pairwise election, but also Chick-fil-A would beat McDonald's in a pairwise election. So there's no majority winner. There's no clear majority winner. Trying to use democracy to ascertain the will of the people it's useful, it's laudable. But here again, this is the inside of Buchanan, and the inside of public choice is that the rules really, really matter for determining what the outcome will be.
In where Buchanan went with a lot of his later scholarship after identifying some of these problems of democracy, was he suggested that we could have constitutional rules to sort of limit the range of democracy. Probably a great example of that would be a balanced budget amendment to say, well, if the federal government is going to borrow too much, if we let them do it, let's go ahead and restrict their discretion. Now, this analysis, though, really takes us in a very different direction. And do you think that it's fair to say that somehow this is like unpatriotic or immoral or something to say we're giving up on democracy because democracy is just ourselves? Can't we just make ourselves better?
Yeah, so I'll admit my intuition is that I want democracy, I want the country to run like it's a family. But again, we're in a country of 300 and some odd million people, 320 million people, I believe. It's not going to run like a family of 2 parents and 3 children. The decisions we're going to have to make are going to be infinitely complex, and things just aren't going to work the way they would if we could have the perfect world we wanted to live in.
Well, it's been very interesting. So what, sort of in wrapping up here, what would be any last thoughts on this here?
Well, I think Winston Churchill was right about democracy. It's the best, it's the worst form of government imaginable, except for everything else that we've tried. And when we think about the problems with democracy or democratic institutions, it's worked pretty well in Europe. It's worked pretty well in the United States. Fundamentally, though, I think the contribution that Buchanan makes and that Buchanan's fellow travelers make is that constitutions matter, rules matter, and how these rules are designed or how these rules emerge will have serious and important implications for the outcomes that we observe.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.